She had spoken before heads of state. She had stood at the edge of famine camps in Ethiopia and looked into the eyes of dying children without looking away. She had done it without trembling, without flinching, because she believed with everything she had that staying steady was the only gift she could offer. But on the morning of November 4th, 1987, inside the Great Assembly Hall of the United Nations Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, Audrey Hepburn stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. And she did not start again for a very long time. The room held 400 people, diplomats, UNICEF officials, journalists, translators sitting behind glass panels with headsets pressed to their ears. All of them had come to hear the most elegant woman in the world deliver a prepared statement about child welfare. The speech had been approved. The talking points had been reviewed. Everything was in order. Then, the silence came. Audrey stood at the podium with her papers in front of her. She had been 3 minutes into her remarks. Her voice had been steady, clear, controlled. The voice of a woman who had spent 2 years visiting the worst places on earth and had learned to speak about them without breaking. But something had shifted. Something behind her eyes changed. She set her papers down very slowly, the way a person sets something down when they no longer need it. She looked out at the room. Then she looked down at the small girl seated at the edge of the stage, a 7-year-old Ethiopian child named Amara, and Audrey Hepburn's composure, the composure that had held through Ethiopia and Sudan and El Salvador, quietly came apart. For a moment, no one moved, no one coughed, no one shuffled a program. The translators behind the glass panels let their hands rest in their laps. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. 43 seconds passed. Then Audrey said 4 words into the microphone, so softly that the journalists in the back row had to check their recordings later to be sure they had heard correctly. I didn't know that. But that moment didn't start there. It started 6 weeks earlier in a gray concrete corridor backstage with a child who had survived something the official reports said had never happened. And what Amara whispered to Audrey in those 10 minutes before the speech, the thing that stopped the most composed woman in the room cold, is the story that history almost forgot to tell. If you have never heard what that little girl said, stay with us, because what she whispered changed the direction of Audrey Hepburn's life and brought a child home. Subscribe now so you never miss a story like this one. What those 4 words cost Audrey and what she had been carrying long before she ever set foot in a UNICEF field camp goes back much further than Geneva. Because the woman standing at that podium was not just a movie star who had taken on a charity role. She was someone who had survived starvation as a child herself, and she had spent 40 years trying to forget it. May 1986, Hollywood. A phone call Audrey Hepburn almost did not take. She was living quietly by then, 57 years old, retired from film, settled into a simple life in the Swiss village of Tolochenaz with her partner, Robert Wolders. She grew roses in the garden. She cooked pasta for neighbors. She read in the evenings. After decades of cameras and contracts and the particular exhaustion of being the most watched woman in any room, she had chosen ordinary life deliberately and without apology. The world still wanted Audrey Hepburn the icon. Audrey Hepburn the woman was perfectly content to let it keep wanting. But UNICEF's executive director, James Grant, was persistent. He had been told she would say no. He called anyway. He made his case quietly. UNICEF needed a goodwill ambassador who would not simply lend her name to letterheads and appear at galas with a practiced smile. They needed someone the world would actually stop and listen to. Someone whose presence in a field camp would make a government pay attention. He believed she was that person. Audrey told him she needed time to think. What she did not tell him, what she had never told almost anyone, was why the request unsettled her so deeply. During World War II, Audrey had been a starving child herself. In Nazi-occupied Arnhem in the Netherlands, she had survived on tulip bulbs, on boiled grass, on whatever could be found in a city being slowly emptied by hunger. She was 10 years old when the Allied liberation came. She was 11 when UNICEF supply drops began reaching Dutch children, bringing powdered milk and food parcels and the first real meals many of them had seen in years. She remembered the taste of that food. She remembered what it meant. She had carried that memory privately for 40 years. She had never used it publicly. It felt too personal, too painful, too much like reaching into an old wound and holding it up for strangers to examine. But Robert Wolders sat with her the evening after Grant's call and said something she could not argue with. He said, "You survived that hunger, and you never spoke about it. Maybe that silence is exactly what disqualifies you from staying quiet now." She thought about that for 3 days. Then she called James Grant back and said yes. But she had one condition. She would not be decorative. She would go into the field and see it herself. And what she was about to see would make everything she thought she understood about the work completely insufficient. The field was nothing like the reports. Audrey had read the documents before her first mission. She had studied the statistics, reviewed the program summaries, absorbed the numbers that UNICEF's teams compiled with genuine care and genuine effort. 200,000 children reached, 43 feeding stations operational, relocation programs serving 600 family units across 3 regions. The numbers were real. The people who wrote them believed in what they were doing. But numbers, Audrey was learning, have a way of making survival look tidier than it is. Her first field visit was Ethiopia in the spring of 1988. She flew into Addis Ababa and drove 3 hours north on roads that turned from pavement to dirt to something that was neither. The camp she visited held families who had been displaced twice in 18 months. The children she met did not look like statistics. They looked like children, with specific faces and specific eyes, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that wanting things leads nowhere good. She knelt in the dirt beside a mother who was nursing an infant and asked, through a translator, how long they had been in the camp. 8 months, the woman said. And before this camp, another camp. And before that, home. She said the word home the way people say the name of someone who has died. Audrey stayed in that camp for 6 hours longer than the schedule allowed. Her UNICEF liaison grew anxious. There were press commitments. There was a dinner with government officials. She did not move. She sat with families and listened and asked questions and wrote things in a small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Not the official things, the things between the official things. The mother whose name appeared on the relocation list as safely transferred, but who had no shelter at the new site for 11 days after arrival. The boy who was registered in one camp's medical program and then vanished from every record when his family moved, because no one had thought to carry the file. She began to notice a pattern. The programs were real, the intentions were good, but there was a gap, a quiet, unglamorous administrative gap between the moment a family was counted and the moment anyone checked on them again. People were falling into that gap every day, and the reports, written carefully and honestly, did not show it. She did not know yet that the child who would make her understand this completely was already waiting, 6 weeks away. In a borrowed white blouse, in a gray corridor in Geneva. The corridor backstage was narrow and cold and smelled of concrete and old carpet. 30 minutes before the Geneva speech, a UNICEF aide led a 7-year-old girl through a side door and sat her on a folding chair against the wall. The girl wore a white blouse that was slightly too large for her, the collar sitting wide on her small shoulders. She held her hands folded in her lap with the patience of someone much older. Her name was Amara Tesfaye. She had traveled from Addis Ababa with a care worker who spoke no French and very little English. She did not know exactly what today was for. She knew only that an important woman wanted to meet her. Audrey came through the corridor at a half walk, still reviewing her notes. She saw Amara and stopped. She looked at the aide and said, "Give us the room." The aide hesitated. There were 10 minutes before the assembly began. Audrey looked at him once more, and he stepped back through the door. She pulled a chair from against the wall, placed it directly in front of Amara, and sat down so that they were exactly eye level. She asked, through a translator who stayed quietly to the side, whether Amara was nervous. Amara shook her head. Audrey asked if she knew what the speech today was about. Amara said yes. She said, "You are going to tell them about us." Audrey said yes, that is exactly right. Then Amara asked a question that Audrey had not prepared for. She asked, "Do you know what happened after the camp at Bati was moved?" Audrey said she had read the reports on the Bati relocation. 240 families transferred. The operation had been logged as successfully completed. Amara looked at her steadily. She said, "My mother was one of those families. She died 4 days after the move. There was no shelter at the new site when we arrived. My mother was already sick. The cold finished it. After she died, I was not in any list anymore. Nobody came, nobody checked. I was not counted." The translator's voice remained even. Audrey's did not move at all. She sat very still and looked at this child who had just described in 4 sentences the exact gap she had been writing about in her notebook for 2 years. For 11 seconds, the most prepared woman in that building said absolutely nothing. She walked on stage carrying everything Amara had just told her. The assembly hall was full and bright and formal in the way that large institutions are formal. The kind of room designed to make what happens inside it feel permanent and important. Audrey took her place at the podium. She looked out at 400 faces arranged in careful rows. She opened her prepared remarks and began to speak. Her voice was level. Her posture was straight. 3 minutes passed without incident. Then she glanced at Amara, seated at the edge of the stage in that too large white blouse, watching the room with the quiet patience of someone who had learned not to expect very much from important people in important rooms. Audrey stopped speaking. She looked down at her prepared pages for a moment. Then she gathered them into a single stack, set them to the side of the podium, and looked back at the room without them. The UNICEF communications director in the 3rd row felt his pen stop moving. He understood immediately that what was about to happen was not on the agenda. He pressed the pen against his notepad slowly, leaving a groove in the paper, and did not look away. Audrey said, "Before I give you the speech I prepared, I want to tell you something I was told 30 minutes ago in a corridor outside this hall." She told them about Amara. She told them about Bati. She told them about the 240 families logged as successfully relocated, and the mother who died 4 days later in a camp with no shelter, and the 7-year-old girl who disappeared from every registry the moment her mother stopped being alive to anchor her to one. She told them about the gap, not with anger, not with tears, with the specific, unhurried clarity of a woman who had decided that the truth was more important than the plan. Then she said, "Every number in every report was once a name. I would like us to remember that today, not as sentiment, as policy." She reached out her hand. Amara walked to her from the edge of the stage. Audrey took the child's hand and faced the room and said, "This is who the numbers are for." The Secretary General was the first to stand. The rest of the hall followed. Amara looked up at Audrey and asked quietly what was happening. Audrey looked down and said, "They heard you." If this story is moving you, subscribe right now and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. But the story did not end in that hall, because within 2 hours of the speech, a very different kind of reaction was forming 3 floors above, in a room Audrey was not invited to. And what was said in that room would force her to make the most important decision of her life. The memo arrived at her hotel room at 7 o'clock that evening. It was 2 pages, typed on official UNICEF letterhead, and it was polite in the way that institutional documents are polite when they are delivering something that is not polite at all. It had been drafted that afternoon by 2 senior communications officials who had watched the Geneva speech from the 3rd row and spent the subsequent hours in a conference room on the 4th floor discussing what it meant for the organization. The memo did not use the word problem. It used the phrase reputational sensitivity. It did not say Audrey had done something wrong. It said her remarks had introduced an unplanned narrative that required careful management going forward. It suggested that her role as Goodwill Ambassador might benefit from a renewed focus on the broader successes of UNICEF's programs rather than on specific operational gaps. In other words, say less about what is failing, say more about what is working. Audrey read the memo twice. She set it on the desk beside her untouched dinner tray. She looked out the window at the lights of Geneva reflecting off the surface of the lake. Then she picked up a pen, wrote 2 sentences on the back of the memo, and had it returned to the 4th floor by a hotel porter before 9 o'clock. She wrote, "I understand the concern. I will continue as I have begun." Robert Wolders, sitting in the chair across from her, watched her seal the envelope. He did not ask what she had written. He already knew the kind of woman he was sitting across from. What the officials on the 4th floor did not know, what almost no one knew yet, was that Audrey was not simply reacting to Amara's story in the way that a compassionate person reacts to a single difficult moment. She was building something. Over the following weeks, she worked with 2 UNICEF field coordinators to draft a formal internal proposal, unglamorous, administrative, precise, that called for a single new standard across all relocation programs. Every family unit would be tracked through 3 post-relocation checkpoints, not 1. No family would be logged as successfully relocated until a field worker had confirmed their status at 72 hours, 30 days, and 90 days after transfer. It was the least cinematic thing she had ever attached her name to. She submitted it in January 1988 without a press release, without a photograph, without telling a single journalist. She was not finished. But the world was about to send her something that made everything else feel small. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. It came in a plain envelope with an Addis Ababa postmark, addressed in careful handwriting to Audrey Hepburn at her home in Tolochenaz. It had been written in Amharic by Amara's grandmother, a woman named Tigist, and translated into English by a teacher at the school near her home who had watched the Geneva footage on a borrowed television set 3 weeks after it aired. Tigist was not an educated woman in the formal sense, but she wrote with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she wanted to say and did not want to waste a single word of it. She wrote that she had seen the broadcast. She wrote that she had watched a woman in a cream dress stand before a room full of important people and say her granddaughter's name. She wrote that 2 days after the Geneva speech aired, a UNICEF field supervisor had contacted the care facility in Addis Ababa where Amara had been staying. The supervisor had seen the broadcast and pulled Amara's file. He found the gap Audrey had described, the missing registry entries, the broken chain of documentation after Amara's mother died. He reopened the file. He made the calls. Within 2 weeks, Amara had been located, formally re-registered, and placed into the permanent care of her grandmother. Tigist's letter ended with 1 sentence. She wrote, "You said her name in a room full of important people, and my granddaughter came home because of it." Audrey read the letter at her kitchen table, alone, on that Tuesday morning, with the garden visible through the window and the house completely quiet around her. She did not share it publicly for 2 years. When she finally did, it was at a small benefit dinner in 1990 to a room of 40 people, read aloud in a voice that did not quite hold steady all the way to the end. It was the last public speech anyone in that room has ever forgotten. Audrey Hepburn was diagnosed with cancer in November 1992. She died on January 20th, 1993, at home in Tolochenaz, with Robert beside her and the garden outside the window. The 3-checkpoint tracking protocol she proposed in January 1988 was adopted by UNICEF in revised form in 1991. It does not carry her name. She would not have wanted it to. Amara Tesfaye is in her 40s now. She works as a community health coordinator in Addis Ababa. She has a daughter. On her desk sits a photograph, grainy, slightly overexposed, of a woman in a cream dress holding a small girl's hand in front of a microphone in Geneva. People who visit her office sometimes ask about it. Amara tells them, "It is a picture of the day someone decided that the truth was more important than the plan." She does not say which one of them she means. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one voice, used honestly at the right moment, can bring someone home. Hit the notification bell, because the stories that matter most are the ones history almost forgot to tell.